let's bring you this incredibly interesting discussion now. The Constitutional Court yesterday hearing a landmark challenge against the constitutionality of a section of the Births and Deaths Registration Act amid concerns that it's discriminatory based on gender. So this is what happened. The applicants are two married couples and they actually successfully contested this legislation in the High Court in the Free State. They demonstrated then that the male spouses were unjustly barred from changing their surnames after marriage. One husband is seeking to adopt his wife's surname while the other insists on hyphenating his surname to include hers. They argue that the existing system's refusal to allow men to take their wife's surname is an infringement on their rights. Let's unpack the cultural considerations that should be made here as we watch that legal discussion take place. And bring in now Mkhulu Nsingiza, CEO of the Zindzi Mandela Foundation, and joins us now via our video link. Thokoza Gogo, great to have you on the program. It's really interesting to watch the debate gain momentum, especially because yet again we're being confronted with issues to do with our identity as society evolves. In my mind, it's very hard to have this conversation without really going back to the origins of surnames when it comes to culture. I'm told in biblical times, for example, people didn't really have surnames. You know, you were Joseph the carpenter or Ayanda the refrigerator guy. And so in that kind of context, how much weight have surnames ultimately garnered in culture?
So much weight because remember that even surnames, we started having surname after we were colonized because they wanted to clearly identify who we are. But before that, people were called by their names, but giving respect to the father that, gave birth, to that person. So these days, you can't because it has been internalized, culture that it is, a woman that marries, into a different home. And, in the cultural sense, it carries so much, that action because you are now entering a completely, new family, meaning Guti, all the culture and, everything that happens in that family, you are now going to adopt and forget. That's why I would hear that elders say that yingakho mama babiza ukuthi they normally die, during because all the life that you lived, all that life you knew, you are now leaving it behind, you are entering. And there are rituals and, customs that should be followed for you to be able to be introduced. I've never, experienced or known a situation where a husband or a man is being married into the woman's, family.
Sure. That
has never happened. I think it's logic that it would... But you see, even the Indlovukazi's surname is not killed because every time they refer to her, they would call her Masbanban, meaning what they are making her name, live and survive, throughout all this so-called, capture by the new family. I'm sorry about that. Captured by the new family. My battery.
Oh dear. We've still got you, Mkhulu. If you want to continue, we can hear you. I know we've lost your video picture, so to speak, but I think we're holding on to every word as you are still explaining to us how even in a matriarchal context, there's, considerations to be made about which surname is ultimately heightened.
Yes, I was trying to explain that, a woman's surname never dies when a kesha. It lives on, throughout, that period. Because whenever they call her, around, that family, they always use her name to say Masbanbani, Masbanbani. because it is meant that, even, when they introduce, as an example, Magupashwa Ekar, they have to call the ancestors of the woman because these are two ancestors that have been joined together now to create this, family, new family. So the surname of, Indlovukazi never died, it lives on. So this is, if you had already accepted the weights, of, Westerners, that is when, I think you will be open to this, to say culture, background doesn't mean anything to me. I've accepted and normalized this Western, culture. So therefore, I have no problem to adopt, a woman's, surname. But in the African sense and culture, that is not allowed.
I'm interested to still take a few steps back, just for those people who perhaps aren't necessarily familiar with what culture demands and ways in which perhaps that can and cannot change. Why can't a man adopt their wife's surname? Outside of the fact that it's never happened before, perhaps it might be frowned upon, what is the actual cultural complication that's introduced if that were to happen?
I think, the difficulty will be because Indlovukazi, or a woman, comes into the family to build, for this family. Now, a man can't go to a woman's family to go and build because there are men of that family who have that responsibility, who are supposed to marry as well, wise women that will be able to assist in, building, that the growth of that family, because when, two families are conjoined, it mostly results in a baby, meaning that the family now is growing and you need somebody, a partner that is sensible and, committed enough to assist you in building, this side of the family. I've never heard of that because it will be impossible for a man to go into another man's, house and start saying that I'm here to build whatever. What are you building? Because there are women and men, who have the responsibility of maintaining and sustaining the growth, of that home.
And how does culture make allowance for families that only have daughters, for example? Again, we're scenario building, we're thinking about ways in which culture safeguards people's survival. But there certainly are scenarios I can imagine where you had a succession of daughters and are legitimately concerned about the building that needs to take place in your own home.
Yes, you see, what we are raising, it's a complication that normally we experience during royal houses, especially those that are led by female Indlovukazi. There's nothing wrong with that. The complication then becomes, whatever child, is born by Indlovukazi, it won't inherit ubukhosi like her because umuntu wangaphandle that impregnated, Indlovukazi. So that brings a challenge in a way. So it becomes, very difficult if, let's say, I have only girls, meaning that, for me, it will be very worrying that who will carry on the traditions and the customs of this family, because I know my daughters have to be married there, and go and build somewhere. Unless, situation, changes and the people are not interested in all those things. This is what complicates things in most. There's nothing wrong with Indlovukazi to be on the leading seat, but then what happens to the offspring of those, people.
Yeah. And, on that very note, we're learning so much about how we, evolved over time. And I suppose in some ways, these productions are helping us think through these different things. What I found very fascinating as we watch the retelling of the stories Kashaka, for example, is the incredibly prominent role that women played, actually, from his mother, Unandi, to Umkabai, the aunt, who were these matriarchs who took up a position that ultimately set a series of events in place that landed up in the history we now know. And I'm only prefacing that with that knowledge because, in my mind, being a man or a woman doesn't guarantee your ability to keep a certain surname going, as we've seen take place in history.
Oh, no, certainly. What you've mentioned, especially about Indlovgazi Mkabayi, you know, he would call others a window because of this and that. Otherwise, you don't have that heart of a lion to be in the city, you know, that we are in. But culturally, black people always respected, you know, women and respected the female energy to a point that you must listen to how we call, you know, Indlovgazi zethu sithi yinkosikazi. You know, that kazi signifies greater, meaning that there's no man who can be without being birthed by a woman. It was an acknowledgement that there would be a king, inkosi, but you know, inkosi ihamba nenkosikazi, meaning ukuthi Indlovgazi, the queen, represents the mother or the womb that gave birth to the king who's now sitting on the throne, which takes me back to ancient, you know, knowledge system, the story of Oset. Oset uNomkhubulwane was regarded as the keeper of, you know, that throne, a custodian of the throne, because everybody that's going to sit on the throne will be birthed by a female. So the female energy was respected all the time. It goes, you know, even cosmically. You find that the energy that energizes the sun, our sun in our solar system, it's a female energy because it comes from the star, the Sirius star, right? So therefore, our ancients understood, you know, this science. Remember that they lived the idiom that says, as above, so is below. So we have to maintain that balance, which is why in the royal house, you know, a king represents the sun. The queen represents, you know, the moon, who is Nomkhubulwane. So that duality has got to be maintained, you know, all the time.
Sure. Fascinating as always. And I suppose a conversation that will continue even after the Constitutional Court comes back to tell us what the law dictates, at least insofar as our Constitution is concerned. But Mkhulu Nsingiza, as always, a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Mkhulu Nsingiza is the CEO of the Zindzi Mandela Foundation, helping us think through how culture might be impacted if, in fact, it is found that parts of the Births and Deaths Registration Act are, in fact, unconstitutional insofar as they discriminate according to gender. This comes, of course, from an instance where two men are hoping to take on their wives' surnames after marriage.